thank you everyone for joining us today on this first session of the International School of Radical Relationism. We have an amazing program for you today, and before we start, and to start us in a good way, I want to introduce Elder Robin Gottfriedson and Lacey Gottfriedson and Shannon Gottfriedson too, to welcome us to the land. We're so grateful to have you here, and it's such an honor, and we're so glad that you're here to welcome us to the territory. So, without further ado, let's start us off in a good way.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Robin Gottfriedson, daughter of the late Gus and Mildred Gottfriedson of Tecumseh to Secwepemc territory. Welcome, elders, relatives, friends, you who may have come far from wherever along the rivers you have come, from the hills and from the valleys. It's good to see you all here. Let us recognize one another, and safe travels back to home, wherever that may be. Cookschip.
Kelt Cookby. Ui es cookstachum des gachachum den sumem. Ui es cookstachkuch des gachtach des achwapmch utluch al chochwai des dem des denri. Cookstachkuch des gachtachkuch des datlachems kuch al chochwai de chua des achwapmch al godens kuch. Kelt Cookby knuchen da kuch es ja in tamoch godens kuch as paach des achwapmch met chapken wens chuchem ach godens kuch. Kelt Cookby. Yuri es gakolchimenchin as knuchen kuch as tzililchstem ach godens kuch as chiamstem. Ach godens kuch yuri et ach achatens kuch na elia na timuchs. Tluchts ilum. Olmat yaus. Is it okay if I take this off? Yes. Okay. We're just going to be doing a welcome song for you guys now. To traditionally welcome you in a good way.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing start to our series. Today we have a slight change of plans. Our speaker that was announced, Jonathan Ogisto, had a medical emergency, but we have the scholar that wrote the seminal article for radical relationism, has been so influential to all of us, Christopher Powell from Toronto University, Metropolitan University, and we are so associate professor of sociology. We're so glad and so happy to have him here address us today. Chris, will you introduce your talk and tell us the title, or if you don't have a title? We are organizing, basically responding to uncertainty when it happens. So here we go. Thank you so much, Chris, and take it away.
Oh my gosh, Monica, thank you for those kind words. It's really lovely. It's wonderful to be here, and it's an honor and a privilege to speak with all of you. I don't have a title. I didn't even think of that until just now, because originally it was going to be Jonathan speaking, and I was just going to be his discussant. But I'll be talking about radical relationism and in different aspects and dimensions, and exploring in particular. What I hope I can do is connect some relatively abstract ideas about ontology and epistemology to more practical considerations around ethics and politics and research and how we do those things. And I hope that we can actually have a discussion and that I can hear from you on the Zoom call and those of you in the room about how relationality could factor into the work and you do in community, in your research, in activism, and in your lives. So that's the short version. Yeah. Is that what you were hoping for, Monica? Just a quick intro, or do you want me to get going on the whole thing? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I muted myself. Definitely get going. That would be amazing. That way people start thinking about what this radical relationism is and then link into your topic.
Okay.
You don't have to define it. They got the video. All I'm saying is, just, start. Whatever you have, Chris, is amazing. Go for it.
Okay. And how much time do we have? About an hour?
It's 8:45, so I'm thinking about, an hour for your presentation or less, and then we leave some time for questions. We have another speaker after a break, after you.
Oh boy. Okay. All right. This is going to be interesting. I'm working very off the cuff, so I apologize in advance if it's a little rough in places. Oh my gosh. So radical relationism. So relational. Let me back up a couple of steps. Relationists often define what we do in contrast with the prevailing mode of thought in European Eurocentric culture, which is dualistic. So famously, for instance, the French philosopher René Descartes understood reality as divided between the world of his mind, which he could directly experience, and which he decided that he could be confident in the reality of, and the world outside of his mind, which he had to construct a philosophical argument for the reality of. That how do I know that I'm not being deceived? This this divide in the nature of reality is expressed in the language of subjective and objective, words that have sort of a lot of different meanings for people, but one very simple way of defining them is to say that what is subjective is what is mind dependent. It's what only exists by virtue of the way that I think about things. And what's objective is what exists independently of my mind. Whether I'm aware of it there or not, the rock that I can bump into in the dark, that kind of thing. And this is a very conventional division, and the problem that Descartes, sort of posed for himself was, well, how do I know that the objective world really exists and really has the qualities that I perceive? And I'm not going to sort of dive into the nature of his answer, because what I'm going to say is that question that he poses is a product of the way that he has divided up his experience of reality, or his understanding of reality. And there's different versions and permutations of this, but we can call all of them dualist, as long as you're making this deep division in the nature of reality between the subjective and the objective. Precisely how you do it, it varies, but it's a very common thing, and we're very familiar with. And then it also tends to connect with, or to some degree map onto, other ontological divisions that have been integral to Eurocentric culture. Division obviously between mind and body, or between spirit and body, which has deep roots in European Christianity and in European Christian denial of the importance of the material world. That in medieval Christian theology, the material world is inferior to the world of the spirit. You're not supposed to be attached to the material world. You're supposed to aim to spiritual transcendence of it. And so there is this, encoded through people's everyday practice of prayer and religious observance, this lived experience of a rupture between the spirit and the body that then gets carried forward into humanistic secular culture in various equivalent conceptual distinctions. And then also the distinction between human society and nature, where humans are understood as having souls and non-humans are understood as not having souls, and therefore as belonging to a different order. And again, obviously, this has roots in Christianity and in the Christian doctrine that man, quote unquote, has dominion over the earth as per God's decree, and the practice that human beings treat non-humans as property, as something you can do, as objects that you can do whatever you want with. So there are these divisions. And then finally, to add another one that has been important in sociology, the division between the individual and society, between individual and collective, or one person in the group. And this gets expressed in political philosophy in the form of a dilemma that democratic theorists like Jean-Jacques Rousseau have to wrestle with. Like, what is the proper relationship between the individual and society? And this matters because liberal political philosophy, to speak very broadly, founds itself on the idea of individual freedom. And yet, because we live in societies, liberal political philosophers had to answer the question of, like, well, how do we reconcile individual liberty with the needs of social order, the fact that we live in cities and groups and communities? And this question has many answers, but it takes the form that it does because there's assumed to be, or built into the conceptualization, there's assumed to be an antagonism, or at least a potential antagonism between individual and society. And I would submit that that's an artifact of the hierarchical authoritarian nature of governance of political institutions in the European tradition, that when liberal political philosophy is establishing itself as emerging historically, it's emerging in the context of and in relation to monarchies, where liberals are involved in trying to construct democracies. And when you replace a monarchy with a representative democracy, even one as narrow as a democracy of propertied white men, you kind of face these problems of institutional continuity. How do we go on organizing and running society without completely reshaping it? And so I would submit that liberal political philosophers found themselves in this condition of trying to recreate the mind and the will of a sovereign through a process of democratic assembly, and that this sort of informs the tension that they perceive between society and individual. But the point that I want to make is that there's all these questions that emerge because of this conceptual distinction that gets made. And those questions carry forward into my discipline, sociology, where sociologists have wrestled with the macro-micro problem. How do we relate the study of individual people interacting and the study of large-scale social processes, and how do we develop a theoretical language for talking about both of those things at the same time without sort of eliminating one or the other, erasing from view one or the other. It's an ongoing problem, and connected with that too, I'm sorry to introduce a lot of table setting here, is the structure agency problem. How do we, let me back up. Sociologists who look at the macro tend to emphasize what's called structure, which is understood as being the ways in which large-scale social formations somehow shape, influence, constrain, direct the behavior of individuals, and where agency is understood as the relatively free choices made by individuals, and structure is understood as the pressure upon individual choice affected by the group. So with all of that being said, the basic idea of relationism, not radical relationism necessarily, just relationism, is that a lot of these questions and problems and puzzles either disappear or they take on a totally different aspect if we stop drawing a ontological divide between subject and object, between individual and society, mind and body, society and nature, all of these. If instead we understood all of these phenomena as constituted relationally. And what that means takes different forms for different writers. Broadly, people talk in the literature, in the social science literature, people talk about relations in a couple of different ways. One is relations as direct processes through which something flows back and forth between two or more concrete actors. There's a relation, here right now we're all talking, I'm talking, you're listening, there's a relation. Another way of talking about relations is as relative positions within a social field. So we could say, I'm a professor, I have a certain institutional authority, maybe many of you listening are students, and that defines a relative position between us that enables or facilitates or encourages certain kinds of interactions and discourages others. So these are not opposed ways of defining relations, they're kind of orthogonal to each other, but they're just kind of different, and it's sort of interesting to note them out. And in the article that I wrote, actually, that Monica is so kind to speak about, I tried to sort of recognize or accommodate both of those ways of thinking about relations by talking about actual relations and potential relations. The relations we're actually engaged in concretely at any given moment, and then the relations that we could have based on how we are configured relative to each other in social fields. There's two steps that I want to describe in the movement from relationism to radical relationism, and one is an onto-epistemological step. I'm going to use this phrase onto-epistemological, meaning ontology meaning how we think about reality, and epistemology meaning how we know things. And I'm going to use them together a lot because actually when you think relationally, the distinction between ontology and epistemology starts to really blur or break down. So onto epistemologically, be radically relational is to approach everything in terms of relations. It's sort of that simple. But what that means is that every time we encounter something that we think is a thing, we are open to examining how that thing is constituted through relational processes, and that we kind of assume that process of investigating and unpacking could extend indefinitely, that there's no final foundation or ground, there's no essences, no platonic forms where we would stop and go, okay, there's the final essential thingness behind all the processes that we see. There's an openness to an indefinite unpacking of relations processes. And I could talk a little bit about why that matters, but I'll just move on. So that's an onto-epistemological radicalism. And I'm using the word radical, by the way, to mean, well, in a way that's informed by its etymology. So I like telling people the word radical comes from the Latin word radix. The Latin word radix, which is also the root of the word radish. Radix means root. To be radical is to go to the roots or to take something to its roots. And so to be radically relational would mean being relationist all the way down to the roots, as far down as you can go. So when I wrote 10 years ago or so, I wrote this article, Radical Relationism and Manifesto, I think I called it, or a proposal or a wish list. I can't remember now. I said at the time that this is onto-epistemologically radical, but not politically radical. And since writing that, I've regretted taking that position. It sort of wasn't true, and also my feelings have shifted. Both of those things have happened. For me, the reason to be onto-epistemologically radical is connected to my love for radical politics and radical transformation. And as a socialist in particular, growing up in a time when, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, capitalist hegemony has really entrenched itself, so that the reality of capitalism, makes itself felt in every aspect of our lives. Being willing to believe that other worlds are possible sometimes takes a real imagination or dedication. And what appeals to me about relationism, about thinking relationally, thinking of things as the product of relations and processes, is there's always this element of fluidity and contingency and the possibility of change, and the possibility of things being organized in fundamentally different ways. So, for instance, like Judith Butler uses relationism to articulate her performative theory, performative theory of gender. That if we understand not just gender in the sense of the cultural attributes of masculinity and femininity, but the very division of male and female as the product of a social relation, of an ongoingly performed social relation, of work, in the Marxist sense of labor, not commodified, but labor that's performed ongoingly, in order to maintain the seeming fixity and solidity, the seeming essentialness of male and female as categories. We understand that that is a process. Then it's a process that could happen differently, and which is what, of course, Butler wants us to be open to thinking about. Gender doesn't have to be the way it is. It might not even have to exist at all as a form of human identity or categorization. And over again, I think you see this in the work of relational thinkers. Foucault, for instance, in his work, proposing a relational conception of power. I say conception because he explicitly said he doesn't provide a theory of power, and I want to take him at his word. You could argue that he does, but he conceptualizes power in relational terms explicitly. Power's not a substance that you hoard up like, a mountain of gold coins. It's an ongoing process of the exertion of force on bodies. And so when identities like the criminal, the delinquent, or the madman, the insane person, or the homosexual, when we understand those identities as the product of power, that means they're the product of these ongoing relations of the exertion of force upon bodies, informed by relations of knowing, processes of knowing. And that means they could be different, or they could not exist at all. They could be abolished. I think Foucault's work aims toward the abolition of sexuality as a form of human identity, meaning the construction of a world in which bodies and pleasures are polymorphously, profusely perverse, So that is the appeal of that radical relationism. And so that's the second kind of layer of it, is the political radicalness of it, which is, I want to associate this word radical with deep transformation, with not necessarily a violent rupture or not necessarily violence at all, but with a change of the world into a different form, which some people might experience as violent, or some people might require some violence to happen. But what's radical about it is the depth of the change. To transform from a capitalist world dominated by the production of exchange value to a socialist world dominated by organized around the satisfaction of human needs. That's a radical change. That's a change that requires a revisioning of an enormous portion of the institutions and practices that shape our lives. A world without gender, a world in which the things that we now associate with gender take a indefinite profusion and plurality of forms, is a radically different world, and so on. A decolonized world is a radically different world. So that is the aim for me, and I sort of also want to flag that different voices even in our little network of relationists sort of have different positions and feelings on relationism and radical relationism and what it means, and I think that's good. I want to sort of note and set aside the usual academic tendency to privilege consensus. A creative dissensus is valuable and worthwhile. So I want to try and say, these are things I think, this is how I think about things. This doesn't have to be how we all think about things together. And we can have interesting and productive, fruitful conversations with that dissensus. So that's my opening kind of introduction. That's all very, very abstract. And I want to bring all of that down to earth. And I wonder if I can pause. Can we do questions like partway through this? Because I would kind of love at this point, I've just laid out a bunch of incredible, I would just operate the highest level of abstraction, short of going into full-blown philosophical terminology. So I'm really curious to ask if there's already thoughts or questions or reactions from the folks in the room.
I'm seeing a hand up, Chris. I'm going to bring the mic because we need it for the live stream. So hold on a minute.
Oh,
question
fantastic.
coming.
This is a Donahue situation. To age myself enormously.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I was curious. So basically, my understanding thus far of Indigenous knowledges and what I've learned in university and whatnot has been that a lot of Indigenous knowledge is centered around relations and everything. Like language is often centered in something's relation to something else in how they describe things. And in this, at least in the Squamish language, people will say all my relations after speaking. And I'm curious how radical relationism, it seems quite similar to a lot of ways that Indigenous knowledges kind of work. I'm curious what function they have together or separately, or if radical relationism is the academic way of being okay, wow, people have known this is how we should relate to each other for a long time, but we're going to now put in academic words. Yeah.
I'm going to have to ask, I didn't catch all of that. Can you repeat that, or?
So the question.
Sorry to ask.
Thank you. No, thanks, Chris. The question is if you could talk to the relationship between radical relationism and how Indigenous ways of knowing who's there's this statement, all my relations. How do they converge? If they converge, am I conveying your question correctly? And what is the connection? If you could talk to that, or are we just putting that into academic words? If you could talk to that, that would be great.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I want to be careful because I'm mindful on the one hand of not wanting to appropriate, and on the other hand also of how kind of limited my cultural literacy is with Indigenous cultures, but I have encountered relational ideas in the work of Tayaka Alfred, for instance, and Leanne Simpson. And so there's definitely overlap. And this gets into actually something that I need to talk about anyways, which is sort of the connection between thinking relationally on an epistemological level and thinking and relational ethics. So I'll come to your question a little by way of something else in the in-between, which is I was recently read a book, Joyful Militancy, that talked about relational ethics in an interesting way, which is that very often in Eurocentric culture, we think of morality in terms of adherence to a particular set of objective norms. So you have a set of rules like the 10 Commandments or whatever, and if you follow those rules, then you're a good person. And in the sort of like stiffer forms of this, like it doesn't matter what situation you're in or context you're in, you follow those rules. You don't steal even if you're starving or if your children are starving, etc. And that's a certain way of thinking about morality in dualist terms. And morality is objective, it is outside yourself. In a Christian version, it's in the mind of God. In a humanistic version, it might be in the Platonic form of justice or something. A relational ethics is could be defined as an orientation to building and maintaining particular kinds of relationships. And this is the version of it that I'm talking about now is rooted in the work of the philosopher Spinoza. So if you want to build a relationship of equality and reciprocity, for instance, then how you do that is obviously going to be fluid and situational and depend on context. And if you're trying to build a relationship of equality and reciprocity, mutuality, then that's going to involve recognizing the needs of both or all parties in that relationship. And those needs, again, might be fluid and contextual and situational. And so you might have to, you can't be too rigid, you can't have fixed rules about how to do that. And I see that in the work of, say, Tayaka Alfred or Leanne Simpson talking about, like Simpson talking about Anishinaabe notions of individuality and community, that in her articulation, individual and society, individual and the group are not opposed things. They ideally support each other and enable each other. And healthy communities produce strong self-determining individuals, and strong self-determining individuals support the collective strength and self-determination of the community. And that's possible through a relationship of reciprocity and mutuality, mutual respect and care. And in her articulation, those relations extend beyond humans. They extend between humans and other than humans. That one relates with animals, plants, the land, through these essentially the same relations of reciprocity, mutuality, and care. And so that's, I think, does that partially answer your question?
And thank you so much, Chris. And I have my little hand up here. It's interesting when you do the Zoom in a room as well. It's hard to see all the hands. So before we continue, and thank you for the pause, I just wanted to say in the Zoom meeting, we have a bunch of people from the International School of Radical Relationism that have joined us. And I just wanted to acknowledge them and say thank you for joining us. They may also want to discuss with you, our students here. And one thing I wanted to contribute to answering your question back there, which is so important, what Chris said about the stressing the need to not appropriate and to say, this is a point where the radical school of relationism, or school of radical relationism, has embraced this way of looking, and I think Chris did stress that there's a diversity of ways of looking. There's a pluriverse, to use the language of the decolonial South Americans, and that means leaving behind the whole idea that there's universal knowledge, like the colonial mindset thinks that universal knowledge is the one that should rule the world. This is walking away from that and looking at the possibility of diverse ways of knowing, or as I was saying, the pluriverse. And also, I wanted to share at the same time, I came across this by looking at the work of Leroy Littlebear, whose talk I attended in the CSA of 2016, I think, that just blew my mind, because he was drawing parallels between the lessons we've learned from quantum physics and the lessons that he was bringing from Blackfoot philosophy, and how everything is in motion, everything's entangled together, everything is energy. There is no real, like Chris was saying, essence or final thingness to the thing. So what this means is the framework, because it's a framework, it's not even like a theoretical perspective that says this is the way. It isn't. It's a framework that welcomes all ways of looking at the world, all ways of thinking, even among us. As Chris was saying, there's difference in looking at how we can be relational or approach relationality, and we think that is an asset of, what did you call it? Creative dissent? Sorry, I'm looking at you in the screen.
Creative dissensus.
Creative dissensus, which can, it makes space, and I don't know how to say it this way, because it's like, oh yeah, we're not allowing, the ways of the world are aplenty, and it's time that we in academia become humble and look at those different worlds of being and doing, and stop trying to say, oh, this is how you know. No, there's many different ways of knowing, and how do we embrace that reality? And so this is what the School of Radical Relationism is trying to do. I hope I gave a bit of a...
Yeah, thank you for bringing in those points. That's really important. Because just to build on that, if I may.
Totally.
One of the dilemmas that gets associated with dualistic thinking is that if something is said to be objectively real or objectively true, then it's totally fixed. It's universal. It's the same for everybody, and I have no choice or control over it at all. And if something is totally subjective, then it's completely fluid. It's just in my mind, and it can be whatever I want it to be, and there's no constraint. And these categories, objective and subjective, make it really difficult to capture the experience that I think most of us have most of the time with many things, which is, or to put it this way, a relationship is neither completely objective nor completely subjective. If you and I are in a relation, I can influence the dynamic of the relationship. And you can influence it. Your actions constrain mine constrain yours. We're interdependent. So what is happening between us is not completely subjective. I can't just decide in my mind, I want this to be another way, and boom, there it is. But neither is it completely objective. It's not completely fixed. And that if we then sort of imagine that basic dyadic relationship between you and me, and that extends outwards to everything that we're interacting with in the world, everything that we're relating to in the world, if we understand that relation as this process that is neither simply in my mind nor simply outside of me and I can do nothing about it, but product of a negotiation, then it stands to reason that different human groups, different cultures will have different knowledges. That knowledge is a relation, and it tends to be dependent on how I know any one thing. Tends to be dependent on how I know everything else around me, and all of those relations are a little elastic and fluid, but not infinitely fluid. So knowledges sort of form in different ways through different cultures. So that's sort of the abstract theoretical reason why pluriculturalism and pluriversality make sense. That basically different networks of people are relating to their world through different configurations of relations, and that's always fluid and dynamic. Yeah.
Do we have?
There's a hand up in the Zoom.
We have another question.
All right.
I'm going to bring you the.
Well, I also maybe just wanted to make a connection that, is that okay? Can I?
We have another question, but if you want to jump into this discussion, that would be amazing, and then Chris.
Oh, no, I can follow. No rush.
Go for it, Kevin.
I just wanted to say that in one sense, this sort of perspective that Chris is describing, one of the reasons it's such a challenge is because the way that science has developed, it integrates the assumption of this dualist type worldview. And so when we talk about good science, usually it presupposes the division between objective and subjective. And so we're fighting against ourselves in a way that is very complicated. And even when we talk in the universities today about what it means to be a good student, usually this debate is present in some form, and relationalism and relationism is trying to confront that and challenge that and push against that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have Chris, and then I have another question in the back. I'll bring you a microphone in a minute.
Okay, so
Go
just
ahead.
talk here?
Yes, please.
Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, this isn't going to sound very academic, but what I want to say is when I was a burning out social worker, and this course, kind of this whole program that I'm in, kind of came into my vision, and I just kind of followed it. And radical relationship that Dr. Monica has presented to me has just given me so much hope, basically, because there's for me it's been a way of meeting with like-minded people and like getting different understandings, and my hope is that my work could be part of I'm doing a lot with social media and documentaries and things like that, and I'm wanting to kind of promote the idea, like the framework of radical relationship, of looking at things differently, like you said, from the root. Like, and I remember Dr. Lakatos spoke about like education and radical relationships, and I thought that was very meaningful also. And so I would love to hear more about educating and bringing these ideas out in our world, using like social medias in the world of algorithms and things like that, and so not preaching to the converted so much. So thank you for this chance.
Thank you, Chris, for that point. I wonder if anyone in the Zoom call would like to address this. Chris, any points? I have another question in the back.
Sure.
Should I gather that question, maybe? All right, thank you so much. Here you have it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the insights. We have so much gathered. My question is this. You made mention of knowledge is a relationship and is objective. If that is the case, why do we have so much epistemic injustice?
So much injustice.
If knowledge is a relationship and is objective, why do we have so much epistemic injustice?
Epistemic injustice.
Yes.
Oh, okay, yes. So, so that's a really great question, and I think I can kind of address both of these questions by saying that it's commonplace in Eurocentric culture to deny relationality, and what part of what dualism often does, not necessarily, but often is work to erase or deny relationships. And whenever somebody's denying a relationship, so radical relationism says, no, there's always a relation. And if you're saying there isn't, then what kind of relation are you constructing through that denial? And often it's not by coincidence, often it's a relation of domination or mastery or objectification. And the part of the point of objectification, of making this divide and saying subjective on this side of the line, agency, choice, humanity, society, objective on that side of the line, things, is to be able to control and dominate. That's why there's so much epistemic injustice, is that the construction of this idea of objective knowledge denies relationality, which means it denies the agency of most people to speak back. The knowledges that got enshrined as objective, or the knowledges, because of the historical process of colonization, the knowledges got enshrined as objective were the knowledges of the colonizers and of white male, affluent or bourgeois colonizers. And because of that, then and then the denial of the relational process, it takes this work of colonized peoples and oppressed peoples generally to expose the relational construction of knowledge and push back against it and to reconstitute knowledge. And then in terms of education, this brings us to the question of if knowledge is a relation, what kind of relation are we trying to construct? We could, without being logically contradictory, we could say, I acknowledge that there's a relation, but I want it to continue to be a relation of domination, so I'm going to do that. I want it to be a domination that favors me instead of someone else. So that would be one thing that logically we could do, but as people in this radical relationist group, that's not what we want to do. We want to construct egalitarian relations. And so the question becomes, how do I construct an egalitarian relation through my production of knowledge? How do I construct an egalitarian relation through my teaching? What does that look like? If we have a school system that's premised on the authority of the teacher, and I want to practice an egalitarian relation in my classroom, how do I do that? That means renegotiating how I relate to my students. It means renegotiating how I relate to the institution that employs me and my fellow academics. It's very challenging, but also very exciting and very interesting. And then if I'm trying to educate people through social media or in pop culture, and I'm trying to construct relations of equality and reciprocity, even when I'm challenging people and correcting them on things they're wrong about or challenging their ideas, how do I do that? It's not obvious, but it's an interesting challenge. And maybe that's where I just wanted to throw that in there, that's kind of where it gets concrete, is that what all this abstract stuff pushes us to do is ask us, what kind of relations are we constructing? And once we attend to that, then we get all these practical questions that come up that are really, which is where I start to feel like maybe those of you in the room have more knowledge than me.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. And if I may, I add a little thing. It's just about time that academia started doing this without being colonial. without trying to impose the objective perspective or the academic or the, right? And it's hard work. It's something that we're still exploring. We're bringing our students in. We're bringing different groups, different nations. We're going to have an amazing talk in a minute from our second speaker today. It's something that we need to build together. And it's a political activity as well. And I wonder if you would like to chat to the students a bit about that ethics that you were, relational ethics, Chris, that you were going to address, and the joy of activism. I'm sorry, I may be butchering it.
Oh, yeah. Joyful militancy.
Joyful militancy. That comes from, like I said, this philosopher Spinoza, who defined joy in an interesting way. Like he said joy isn't, for him, joy wasn't happiness. Joy is an expansion of our ability to affect and be affected. So joy can happen even in moments of suffering and struggle. And in fact, very often, that's where we find it. And so if I am oriented to my own joy, and I'm oriented to my relationality with others, that invites me to be oriented to the joy of others. And then the ethics becomes, how do we have relations? How do we have joyful relations? How do we have relations that enhance each other's ability to affect and be affected, to put it that way. And that's a question that we can carry into every relationship in our lives, whether it's our working, our teaching, and I sort of want to, turn that around for you. Like, I'm curious what those of you who are in the room, what brought you here to this talk? Like, in what parts of your life, what work are you doing that either is already relational or where being more relationally oriented would make a difference? Is there anyone who would like to? We have another person here who wants to make a point. Thank you, Lydia.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I just started my master's, but I already have like the entire idea for my thesis laid out. And I wanted to look at like mutual aid and dual power structures under neoliberal capitalism. And I think this idea of radical relationism really works with that. We currently have really the one relation as a consumer reliant on labor and all of that. In regards to, but in contrast to, like, I want to try and construct these ideas around community involvement where we're creating relations with one another and able to start producing on our own and not having to always be reliant on one single structure that if it breaks, we're all screwed, So I think like I hadn't heard about radical relationism much before this talk, but it's something that I would really like to look into.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Oh, good. Goody. You have another point here.
Hi. So thank you so much for your talk. This isn't so much academic, but I do some advocacy work in the community, and a big focus of ours is trying to build really supportive and strong communities to ensure that we can keep doing advocacy work, we can do activism in a society where that can be difficult sometimes, and where capitalism really forces you to be individual and focused on individualism. So we're trying to build community amongst ourselves, but also in trying to encourage, the broader Kamloops community to be involved, and how we can be supportive in people's journeys of becoming comfortable in their own advocacy work. And so I think this is a really interesting topic, especially the joyful militancy. I'd like to look into that more later on. So thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to say something about this? Anyone in the Zoom?
Yeah, I'm posting into the Zoom link to the book I was just mentioning, Joyful Militancy. If I can sort of maybe build on the last comment too, it sounds like if you're trying to build a strong community, would it be fair to say then you're trying to build strong relations amongst the members of the community, and that cuts against the grain of the way that a lot of like neoliberal discourse maybe talks about community. I was working with a graduate student last winter who does work with youth and youth at risk, and it seems like a lot of the prevailing like policy models are like, what are the individual attributes of a person who is an at-risk youth, and how do we modify those individual attributes so that they have kind of better attributes and that they'll be less at risk, like, and that way of thinking, that individualistic way of thinking, and that thinking relationally meant like shifting a lot of things, because it meant shifting, asking the questions you're asking, like what are the relations this person has with the world around them, but also what are the relations that I'm enacting in my work with them, like as a service provider, or as a professional who's paid to do this kind of work. Am I enacting a dominance relation where I'm the authority who knows how their life should be, and I'm giving them like the knowledge, or is a more egalitarian, more reciprocal relation where we're both potentially transformed through this relation, and where we both shape and determine like the nature of the relationship and where it goes and how it works, and maybe it's that relationship itself that is the most transformative thing for that person. Does that sort of ring true? Does that sound like?
Seeing a lot of heads nodding. Good. I'm seeing the time. It's 9:35. How are we doing? Do we need a break? Or is there any more questions? Anything that's urgent to discuss right now?
Yes, I just wanted to clear my dissonance. I'm having a little dissonance.
Hold on. Okay.
Yes, I just want to clear my doubts, if I may say that. Are you trying to tell us that for you to impact knowledge, or for you to have a kind of result you needed when you are doing some work or doing some presentation or trying to achieve a target goal, you must create a relationship with the target audience or community or the environment in which you want to achieve a target goal?
Did you get all that, Chris?
So is the question, am I saying that to achieve a goal, I need to have like a perfect relationship?
Well, to engage in a relationship with the target or with the objective or with the target community, I think that's what you're asking. What?
When you want to achieve a target goal,
When you have to, when you want to achieve a target goal with the community, do you have to develop a relationship with the community?
Oh, that's a great question. My immediate impulse is to say there's always a relationship. If I'm working with or upon people, I'm always constructing some kind of relationship, and they're constructing it back with me. And the question becomes, what kind of relationship is emerging from that process, right? Like, is it a adversarial or dominance relationship where I come in and I'm like directing people, or is it a more mutual, co-constituted relationship where we produce together whatever the outcome is going to be. And if I'm oriented more to that neutrality, then I might be less attached to a specific outcome. Right, especially one that I predetermined going in. How do I know what that community needs? What makes me so, what before I've even begun relating with them, how could I possibly know? I would have ideas, obviously, but it's worth asking where those ideas come from.
Yeah, that's a good point. I see Sultan's hand up. Maybe he's got a point to make. Sultan, and then I have another question here.
Hi, Chris.
Oh, it's not a
Thank
question.
you for this exciting talk. Would you say that the Western concept of private property, or just property as it were, has its roots in dualistic thinking?
Certainly, I think dualistic thinking facilitates private property. They complement each other. Because dualism erases, it objectifies things, and it supports this objectification. So for something to be property, you have to really narrow the possible scope of relations that you have with it, and really make them kind of flow in one direction. Like I can control you, but you can't control me. If we think relationally, then the artificiality of that becomes more obvious, and becomes easier to challenge.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Thank you so much. I have a comment. I have a comment right here from another student.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. So, looking at this, everything that keeps popping in my head was, this is like the opposite of Eurocentric system. Because at the end of the day, if you are engaging in a community, first of all, you have to go to that community. For example, there is a present situation where people just go to a community and assume, oh, these people need water. So radical relationism is going to build on, you go in, take the survey first, understand that no, it's not water we need. We want something else. We want road. So I think it also brings us back to indigenous ways of knowing. Because at the end of the day, these people are connected to that land. These people are connected to the system and everything it entails. So it's going to be the world. I don't want to rush and say, oh, radical relationism is going to be like the solution to the world problem. But at the end of the when you go to the people and you know what they want and you solve it that way, it's not dominary. So I think I appreciate the concept of radical relationism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it may actually be more effective. Because if you come here with your pre-made solutions and then just impose them, honestly, is it going to work? Another thing I wanted to add about the radical relational framework that I have discovered and that I think people in the group share is this ethical approach of humility. Because we don't know everything. I mean, as colonizers, they thought they did, but that's colonial. And so the decolonial way of thinking is more like, right, let's establish a relationship. Let's see what it is that is needed. Let me learn from what it is that's happening on the ground. And that way produce solutions that are actually going to work. And this entails, humility also entails, and we're going to talk about this further later on in the course, embracing uncertainty. And can we do that from the universities? Like even the name of university is like universe in there, right? It's kind of sneaking in. I would call it pluriversity sometime in the future, maybe. But and that's creative and imaginary thinking. But the thing is, right, if you have all the solutions from your objective and substantialist perspective, then where is the relationship is going to be one of domination.
Well, the intention of colonial people is mostly dominary.
Yeah.
So the intention at the onset is not to solve the problem. It's what I can take, what I can benefit.
Extractive. Yes, and that's a whole other can of worms that we should. Oh, Rebecca, I see your hand up. Please join us. Hello, welcome. It's lovely to meet you and see your face. We hadn't met.
Hello, yes, thank you so much. And it's lovely to be here. And I'm sorry I can't see all of you in the room, but thanks so much, Chris, for bringing together this discussion as well through your talk. I just wanted to throw in this idea that there's this lovely concept. It's a Mi'kmaq concept, so from Indigenous from the other coast of the continent, which is called a twatmonk. And it's often translated as two-eyed seeing because it kind of like refers to almost like, glasses, like these two lenses. But actually the real translation, as I understand it, from Elder Albert Marshall, who talks about this, is the gift of multiple perspectives. So it's this pluriverse idea, but one of the really amazing things about this concept and this kind of idea of it being like lenses is, we and multiple eyes is, they don't happen in parallel. It's not like there's just all these different things and they're all talking about the same thing, but actually from a relational perspective, when you close one eye and then you open it back up again, it changes your vision, So this idea that this relational engagement between all of these different ways of knowing and thinking is so important. And then this comes along this idea, of like just genuine dialogue that someone called James Tully talks about, which is this idea of, it's kind of a reframing, I think, of maybe possibly, or a different take on this idea of dissensus you mentioned, Chris, because it's this idea that, I get to speak and explain my framework from my worldview, and I often sort of talk about ontology or from that like language of worldview, and that you can't really ethically engage with me or understand what I'm saying unless you really can listen to and hear and see my distinct worldview and framework of understanding it. Anyways, I just wanted to bring that in, and I just also wanted to acknowledge, I think there's been a few people mentioning Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge systems, and I think it's really important to acknowledge, again, striving not to appropriate, but really to acknowledge the ways in which Indigenous worldviews, ways of knowing and being have also deeply influenced, I think, Western traditions and European traditions of relationalism that are, I think that's really important because they're, Indigenous traditions, based in millennia of ways of living and thinking relationally are so important. And there's so many important concepts. Like there's one that I'm thinking of, which is, Sean Wilson, who's a Cree scholar, talks about how we're not in relationship, we are our relationships. And then I think of a colleague and friend of mine, Utiaj, who's of the Shuar Nation down in Ecuador's Amazon, and he talks about how the concept of the human is actually a Western construct. So like these like ways that I think really pushes these European based or Western traditions of relationalism in important ways, and that's part of that two-eyed seeing of changing the ways, like relationally, that all these traditions kind of thing. So thanks for the exciting dialogue today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for that contribution. It is really amazing. And I'm now seeing the time, and I'm seeing it's 10 to 10. I'm sure we're all very excited and full of points to make and eager to engage in more dialogue. And also, it's an amazing way in which, Chris, thank you so much for engaging in this embracing of uncertainty with us and dealing with the emergency when Jonathan is not here and we were planning to have him as speaker. So that's an amazing, thank you so much. Everyone, please, a big hand for Christopher Powell and all of our members of the International School of Radical Relationism. Thank you so much. I am going to disconnect the everyone, if you would like to stay in the room, because we have another amazing speaker right after this spot, we'll take a 10-minute break and start right at, say, 10. And people can come up for some coffee. I'm going to disconnect the projector. But everyone, if you would like to stay in the Zoom call, that would be amazing. You still will have the owl, and you'll have a chance to look into the room. And amazing. Thank you, everyone, for joining here today. We're going to take a 10-minute break.